The soft clinking of cutlery on porcelain was the only sound that felt real. Everything else was a blur of polite smiles and muted chatter, a watercolor painting left out in the rain. It was my 70th birthday lunch, hosted at the finest restaurant in Havenwood, the one with the white tablecloths and the sommelier who spoke in hushed, reverent tones. My daughter, Clara, had arranged it all. She sat across from me, her smile a little too bright, her eyes darting around the room as if checking for exits. Her husband, Mark, sat beside her, a portly man whose expensive suit seemed a size too tight, both physically and metaphorically. He kept patting my hand, his touch feeling more like an appraisal than a gesture of affection. My grandchildren, young Leo and Maya, were thankfully oblivious, chattering about a video game, their youthful energy a stark contrast to the thick, unspoken tension that I felt settling in my bones. It was a strange sensation, this feeling of being celebrated yet feeling entirely invisible. For weeks, Clara had been talking about this day, about making it special, about honoring me. Yet, as I looked at her, I didn't see a daughter honoring her mother. I saw a businesswoman closing a deal, every movement calculated, every word a carefully placed step towards a predetermined goal. A quiet dread had been my companion for months, a low hum beneath the surface of our conversations, and today, that hum had grown into a throbbing, ominous chord. I tried to focus on the good. The way the light caught the crystal water glasses, splintering into 1,000 tiny rainbows. The rich, earthy smell of the truffle risotto placed before me. The innocent laughter of my grandchildren. These were the things that were supposed to matter. These were the moments I was supposed to cherish in my twilight years. But the unease was a physical presence, a cold spot at the back of my neck. Clara was talking, her voice animated, telling a story about a recent holiday. I watched her lips move, but the words were just noise. My gaze drifted past her, to Mark, who was subtly, almost imperceptibly, nodding at someone behind me. My heart gave a small, painful lurch. I pretended to adjust my shawl, turning my head just enough to follow his gaze. A man in a sharp gray suit, holding a leather briefcase, stood near the restaurant's entrance, trying to look casual as he studied a painting on the wall. Mr. Davies, a high-powered real estate developer from the city. Clara and Mark had introduced me to him a month ago, under the guise of him being an old college friend of Mark's. They had said he was just passing through Havenwood and was enchanted by the area. He had visited the inn, my inn, the Willow Creek Inn, and had been effusive with his praise. He'd talked about its charm, its potential. I remember feeling a prickle of pride, but also a deeper, more primal sense of suspicion. His eyes hadn't seen charm, they had seen square footage. He didn't see history, he saw a teardown. My blood ran cold. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying, deafening clang. The constant talk about my retirement. The casual questions about the inn's finances. The binders of paperwork Mark had offered to organize for me, which I had politely declined. They thought I was a doddering old woman, lost in memories, too frail to manage my own affairs. They had mistaken my quiet grief for senility, my deliberate pace for incompetence. I turned back to the table, my face a carefully constructed mask of pleasant neutrality. Clara was now leaning towards Mark, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, believing I was too engrossed in my meal, too deafened by age to hear. But I heard. Oh, I heard every single soul-crushing word. Her lips were so close to his ear, her breath a poison dart. While I distract her with the cake and the gifts, she murmured, the sound slicing through the curated ambience of the restaurant. You get the papers signed by Mr. Davies. The offer is only good for today. She forgot. In her rush to liquidate my life, in her eagerness to cash in her inheritance before I was even gone, she forgot one crucial detail. She forgot who had laid the foundation of that inn with her own 2 hands. She forgot who had mixed the mortar, who had hammered the nails, who had wept with exhaustion and joy within those walls. She forgot who built it. And in that moment, as the waiter approached with a birthday cake ablaze with 70 tiny stars, the watercolor painting of my life snapped into sharp, painful focus. The blur was gone. I saw everything, and I knew exactly what I had to do. The weight of that whisper settled not in my ears, but deep within my chest, a cold, heavy stone. For a moment, the entire world seemed to freeze. The flames on the birthday cake danced in slow motion, their light reflecting in Clara's triumphant eyes. Mark's subtle, satisfied smirk. The innocent faces of my grandchildren, clapping their hands in delight. It was a perfect tableau of betrayal, a masterpiece of familial deception, and I was the unwitting subject, the sad old woman in the center of the frame. My first instinct was a tidal wave of raw, volcanic anger. I wanted to stand up and shatter the illusion, to send the cake flying, to let the silence be broken by the ugly, unvarnished truth. But another feeling, older and deeper, held me in my seat. It was a profound, bottomless sorrow. A grief not for my late husband, Arthur, but for the living, breathing daughter sitting across from me, a stranger wearing my child's face. How had we arrived at this desolate place? My mind, a vessel I had long thought was sailing towards a peaceful harbor, was suddenly thrown back into the storm, back to the very beginning. It wasn't always the Willow Creek Inn. At first, it was just the old Miller place, a derelict farmhouse on the edge of Havenwood that had been empty for a generation. The townsfolk said it was haunted by bad luck. The roof sagged like a tired old man's shoulders, windows were boarded up like blind eyes, and the willows by the creek had grown so wild they choked the very light from the property. Arthur and I were young, barely 30, with more dreams than dollars in our pockets. He was a carpenter by trade, with hands that could coax poetry from wood, and I was a librarian with a love for stories and a secret talent for baking. We had a tiny apartment in the city, the constant noise a grating soundtrack to our lives, and we yearned for a quiet place to put down roots. I remember the day we first saw it. It was a damp autumn afternoon. The realtor, a kind but skeptical man named Mr. Henderson, tried to steer us away. "It's a money pit, Eleanor," he'd warned, kicking at a rotten porch step. "You and Arthur deserve something." Finished. But Arthur, my Arthur, he saw something else. He walked the perimeter of the house, his hand resting on the graying, weathered siding. He looked past the decay, past the neglect. He saw the strong stone foundation. He saw the hand-hewn beams in the barn. He saw the way the afternoon light fell across the overgrown meadow. He turned to me, his eyes alight with a fire I hadn't seen since the day he'd proposed. "Ellie," he said, his voice full of awe, "this is it. This is our story. It just needs a new chapter." We poured every penny of our savings into the down payment. Our families thought we were insane. My mother wept. Arthur's father, a pragmatic man, simply shook his head and said we were buying a lifetime of splinters. And he was right, in a way. The first year was nothing but splinters, both literal and metaphorical. We lived in 2 rooms of the ramshackle house while we worked on the rest. Our bed was a mattress on the floor, our kitchen a hot plate and a kettle. Every morning, we'd wake up covered in a fine layer of dust, our muscles aching with a satisfying, purpose-driven pain. Arthur was the architect of our dream. He'd be up at dawn, his hammer a steady heartbeat echoing through the valley. He taught himself plumbing from a tattered library book, his curses echoing from beneath the floorboards. He rebuilt the collapsed porch, salvaging what wood he could and milling new planks himself. I was the heart of the operation. I learned to strip wallpaper, to plaster walls until my arms felt like lead. I spent weeks on my hands and knees, scraping away decades of grime from the original hardwood floors, discovering the beautiful, warm cherry wood beneath. Clara was just a baby then, a bundle of warmth and curiosity. We'd place her in a playpen in the corner of whichever room we were working on, and the sound of Arthur's saw would be her lullaby. I remember her tiny hands, covered in flour as I kneaded dough on a makeshift counter, her laughter the sweetest sound in that dusty, chaotic world. To us, we weren't just renovating a house. We were crafting a life. We were building a sanctuary, not just for us, but for weary travelers, for people who, like us, needed a quiet place to rest and feel at home. The plan was simple and, to us, beautiful. 6 guest rooms, each one unique. A communal dining room where I would serve hearty, home-cooked meals. A library filled with the books I had so carefully curated over the years. We called it the Willow Creek Inn, a promise of the peace we hoped to offer. But the money pit Mr. Henderson had warned us about was real. Our savings evaporated faster than morning mist. The bank loan was a hungry beast, always demanding more. There were nights we'd sit at our rickety table, staring at a pile of red-inked bills, the silence thick with fear. On one of those nights, Arthur put his head in his hands. "Maybe they were right, Ellie," he whispered, his voice broken. "Maybe we were fools." I knelt beside him and took his rough, calloused hand in mine. I pointed out the window, towards the creek. "Look, Arthur. The willows. They bend, they sway in the storm, but their roots hold fast. We just need to hold fast." I didn't know if I believed my own words, but I knew I had to believe them for both of us. That night, I sold my grandmother's gold locket, the only piece of fine jewelry I owned. The money paid for a new water heater and kept the bank at bay for one more month. It was a small sacrifice in the grand scheme of things, a drop in an ocean of debt, but it felt monumental. It was a piece of my past, traded for a sliver of a future. A future that, at my 70th birthday lunch, my daughter was trying to sell to the highest bidder. She didn't know about the locket. She didn't know about the nights of whispered fears and fragile hopes. She had forgotten the cost of the foundation she was so casually standing on. The struggle to open the inn was a war fought on 100 different fronts. There was the financial front, a relentless siege by the bank and our ever-dwindling funds. There was the physical front, a daily battle against decay, against gravity, against the sheer stubbornness of an old house that didn't want to be tamed. And then there was the emotional front, the quiet, internal skirmishes fought in the dead of night when exhaustion wore down our defenses and doubt crept in like a chilling fog. I remember one winter, the second winter of the renovation, was particularly brutal. A series of snowstorms buried Havenwood, cutting us off for days at a time. The temperature dropped so low that the pipes Arthur had so painstakingly installed froze solid. We woke one morning to a sickening crunch and the sound of rushing water. A pipe in the ceiling of the main hall, the room we envisioned as our grand library, had burst. I stood there in my robe, watching in horror as icy water poured down onto the beautiful cherry floors I had spent a month restoring. It felt like the house itself was weeping. Arthur's face was a mask of despair. This was a setback we couldn't afford. It meant tearing out a section of the new ceiling, replacing the pipe, and refinishing the floor all over again. It meant more time, more money we didn't have. I saw him slump against the wall, the fight draining out of him. But in me, something else ignited. A fierce, stubborn anger. I would not let this broken house break us. I grabbed every bucket, every towel we owned. I started sopping up the water, my hands numb from the cold. "It's just water, Arthur," I said, my voice sharp, trying to cut through his despondency. "We've faced worse than water." We worked for 2 days straight, drying the room, assessing the damage. We ate canned soup standing up, our bodies aching, our spirits frayed. That was when Clara, who was about 5 by then, started to change. She had been our little shadow, our cheerful mascot. But the endless work, the constant tension, began to wear on her. She started having nightmares. She would cry when Arthur left in the morning to pick up supplies, and she would cling to me, her little face buried in my apron, begging me not to go back to the dusty place. She didn't see a future home. She saw a monster that was eating her parents. I tried to include her, to make it a game. I'd let her paint a wall with a bucket of water and a clean brush. I'd tell her stories about the families who used to live in the house, about the children who once played in the meadow. But her resentment was a tiny, hardy seed that had found purchase in the cracks of our preoccupation. One afternoon, I found her sitting on the porch steps, methodically pulling the petals off a daisy I had planted. "Mommy," she asked, her voice flat, "when will you and Daddy be finished loving the house so you can love me again?" Her words were a dagger to my heart. I pulled her onto my lap, my eyes filling with tears I refused to let fall. I tried to explain, to make her understand that we were building all of this for her, for our family. But how do you explain a dream to a child who is living a nightmare of neglect? I realized then that in our quest to build a future, we were in danger of demolishing our present. That night, I made a new rule. No work after 6 o'clock. From 6 until her bedtime, our time was hers and hers alone. We'd read stories, play games on the floor, and I'd sing her to sleep. It was a sacrifice of precious hours we couldn't spare, but it was necessary. Arthur and I would work late into the night after she was asleep, our movements quiet, our conversations whispered, two ghosts haunting our own future home. Finally, after 3 long, grueling years, the day came. We opened the Willow Creek Inn. We only had 3 rooms ready, and the paint was still tacky in the hallway, but it was a start. Our first guests were a young couple on their honeymoon. I cooked them the best meal of my life on my new, gleaming stove. Arthur served them, his face beaming with a pride that was almost painful to witness. That night, after they had retired to their room, Arthur and I stood in the new library, the smell of lemon polish and old books filling the air. He wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. "We did it, Ellie," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. We held fast. The inn became our life. It was more than a business. It was an extension of our marriage, a living testament to our partnership. I was the warmth, the welcome. I remembered every guest's name, how they took their coffee, the stories they shared over breakfast. Arthur was the steady hand, the quiet strength. He was the one who kept the old house running, who fixed the leaky faucets and creaky floorboards, who planted a new tree in the meadow for every year we were open. Clara grew up within those walls. She did her homework at the big oak table in the dining room. She learned to ride her bike on the long gravel driveway. She had her first kiss under the oldest willow by the creek. But she was always an observer, never a participant. She saw the endless laundry, the constant stream of strangers in her home, the phone ringing at all hours. She helped, of course, but always with a sigh, with a sense of obligation. The inn was the third person in our family, the demanding sibling who always got the most attention. She couldn't wait to leave it behind. When she left for college, the relief on her face was unmistakable. It was her escape. And I suppose, in my heart, I couldn't blame her. She hadn't chosen this life. We had chosen it for her. I just never imagined that one day she would try to take it from me. The years following the inn's opening were a blur of seasons and faces. Summers were a whirlwind of visiting families, the sound of children's laughter echoing in the meadow. Autumns brought the leaf peepers, couples who would sit by the fire in the library, sipping my spiced apple cider. Winters were quiet, a time for rest and repair, for Arthur to work on his projects and for me to test new recipes. Springs were a burst of life, the gardens erupting in color, the creek swelling with melted snow. It was a good life. A hard life, but a deeply satisfying one. The inn became a part of Havenwood's fabric. We hosted town meetings, charity bake sales, and even a few small weddings. The people who had once called us fools now pointed to the inn with a sense of local pride. We had taken the town's forgotten ruin and turned it into its crown jewel. We had proven them all wrong, but more importantly, we had proven ourselves right. The dream had been worth it. But time, like the creek that ran beside our property, flows in only one direction. Arthur, my strong, indefatigable Arthur, began to slow down. It started subtly. A project in the barn left unfinished. A weariness in his eyes that no amount of sleep could erase. He, who had once hoisted beams onto his shoulders, now struggled to carry a bag of groceries. The doctor called it a failing heart. I called it a life of loving and labor taking its final, inevitable toll. His last few years were quiet. He'd sit on the porch he'd built, watching the guests come and go. He couldn't work with his hands anymore, but he became the inn's official storyteller. He'd regale visitors with tales of the renovation, of the burst pipe, of the time a family of raccoons took up residence in the attic. He made our struggle sound like a grand adventure, a charming folktale. He never spoke of the fear, or the debt, or the nights we'd nearly given up. He polished the past until it shone. Clara, now married to Mark and living in the city, would visit on holidays. Her visits felt performative. She'd bring expensive gifts we didn't need and talk endlessly about her successful career in marketing. She looked at her father's decline with a kind of impatient pity. She'd speak to me in hushed tones about options, about assisted living, about selling the inn so we could finally relax. She didn't understand that the inn was what kept us going. It was our purpose. To sell it would be like tearing the heart out of a living thing. "This place is too much for you, Mom," she'd say, gesturing vaguely at the bustling dining room. "It's a burden." "It's not a burden, Clara," I'd reply, my voice patient. "It's our life's work." She would just shake her head, a small, frustrated sigh escaping her lips, as if I were a stubborn child who couldn't see reason. She and Mark saw the inn as a set of numbers on a balance sheet, an asset. They never understood that its true value was measured in splinters and sacrifices, in laughter and tears, in the echo of my husband's hammer. When Arthur passed, a profound silence fell over the inn. The sturdy, steady heartbeat of the place was gone. For months, I felt like a ghost in my own home, wandering the halls he had built, my hand trailing along the walls he had plastered. Every creak of the floorboards was a whisper of his name. The grief was a physical weight, making every task, every breath, feel impossibly heavy. I closed the inn for the first time in 30 years, hanging a simple, handwritten sign on the door, "Closed for a season of sorrow." That was when Clara and Mark's help intensified. They descended upon the inn like consultants hired to streamline a failing company. Mark, with his background in finance, took over the bookkeeping, tutoring over my antiquated ledger system. He brought in spreadsheets and software, turning my collection of stories and relationships into data points. Clara focused on rebranding. She talked about a minimalist aesthetic, about targeting a younger, wealthier clientele. She wanted to replace my handmade quilts with generic white duvets, my collection of mismatched antique teacups with uniform, sterile mugs. "We have to modernize, Mom, or the business will die," she insisted. "The business is not dying, Clara," I told her, my voice trembling with a frustration I tried to hide. "It's just grieving." They started bringing people by. Investors, they called them. Sharp-suited men and women who walked through my home with cold, appraising eyes. They talked about occupancy rates and profit margins. They tapped on walls, looking for what could be knocked down to create open-concept spaces. With each visit, I felt a piece of the inn's soul, a piece of Arthur's legacy, being chipped away. I resisted. I politely but firmly declined their suggestions. I ignored their talk of selling. I reopened the inn on my own terms, welcoming back my familiar, loyal guests who loved the quilts and the mismatched teacups. I thought my resistance was a clear message. I thought they would eventually understand that this was my home, my decision. I was wrong. I had underestimated their persistence. I had underestimated their greed. And I had overestimated my daughter's love. My 70th birthday was not a celebration. It was a deadline. It was the culmination of their year-long campaign to wrest my life's work from me. And so I found myself back at that table, the cake melting under the heat of the candles, the sound of Clara's whisper echoing in the silent, shattered chambers of my heart. While I distract her, she thought me a distraction, an obstacle, a sentimental old fool to be managed and manipulated. The sorrow I felt was so immense it almost choked me. But beneath the sorrow, the old, familiar fire I'd felt during the winter storm began to smolder. The stubborn anger that refused to be broken. They had forgotten who I was. It was time for me to remind them. The song began, a clumsy, off-key rendition of Happy Birthday. My grandchildren sang with gusto, their pure voices a painful counterpoint to the ugliness that had just transpired. Clara led the chorus, her smile stretched so wide it looked like a grimace. She caught my eye, a flicker of something impatience? Anxiety, before it was replaced by a saccharine sweetness. "Make a wish, Mom," she chirped, gesturing towards the cake. I looked at the 70 tiny flames, each one a beacon for a year of my life. A year of joy, of struggle, of love, of loss. I thought of Arthur, of his calloused hands and his unwavering belief. I thought of the cold, desperate night I sold my grandmother's locket. I thought of a 5-year-old girl pulling petals from a daisy, asking when her parents would love her again. I took a deep breath. My wish was simple and silent. I wished for strength. I blew out the candles. Not all at once, but in a slow, deliberate wave, extinguishing them one section at a time until the last flame vanished, leaving behind tendrils of gray smoke that smelled of sugar and wax. The table erupted in applause. Mark was already on his feet, patting my shoulder again. Wonderful, Eleanor. Just wonderful. 70 years young. His voice was booming, overly cheerful. He was acting. They were both acting. The whole lunch was a stage, and they had just delivered their crucial lines. The waiter began to cut the cake. Clara leaned in, her face a mask of loving concern. "Are you all right, Mom? You seem a little distant." "I'm fine, darling," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. The smoldering ember in my chest had caught. It was a low, controlled burn now. Just a lot to take in. 70 years. It's quite the milestone. "Well, we have a few gifts to help you celebrate," she said, pulling a large, beautifully wrapped box onto her lap. "To help you start your next chapter." The next chapter. The one they had written for me. The one where I was quietly shuffled off to a condo in a retirement community, my hands empty, my purpose gone, while they divided the spoils of my past. I held up a hand. "The gifts can wait, Clara," I said. My tone was gentle, but it held a new, unyielding firmness that made her pause. Mark, who had been glancing towards the restaurant entrance, where Mr. Davies was now pretending to take a phone call, froze. "Leo, Maya," I said, turning to my grandchildren. "Your grandfather Arthur always said that the best part of a birthday cake is eating it. Why don't you two go with the waiter and make sure he gives you the biggest slices?" The children, delighted, scrambled to follow the waiter. As they left, a bubble of innocence and joy seemed to go with them, leaving the three of us in a stark, adult silence. I folded my hands on the tablecloth. "Clara, Mark, there's something we need to discuss." Clara's smile tightened. "Mom, can it wait? It's your birthday." It was a protest, but her eyes darted nervously towards Mark. The plan was going off script. "No," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "It cannot wait. Because it seems my birthday is also a business deadline." The color drained from Clara's face. Mark opened his mouth to say something, a blustering denial no doubt, but I cut him off, my gaze fixed on my daughter. "I am old, Clara," I began, "but I am not deaf. And I am not a fool. While you distract me with cake and gifts, Mark is to get papers signed by Mr. Davies. Is that the plan?" Silence. A thick, suffocating silence. Clara looked as though I had struck her. She couldn't form a word. Mark sank back into his chair, his face a mottled red. He looked at Clara, a panicked, accusing glare. The conspirators were turning on each other. "I want to tell you a story," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "Not the polished version your father used to tell. The real one." I told them everything. I told them about buying the derelict Miller place when everyone said we were crazy. I told them about living in 2 dusty rooms, about Arthur teaching himself plumbing from a book, about me stripping floors until my hands were raw and bleeding. I told them about the night the pipe burst, the freezing water, the feeling of absolute despair. "Your father wanted to quit that day," I said, my voice cracking for the first time. "He was ready to walk away. I'm the one who wouldn't let him. I'm the one who stood in that freezing water and started bailing." I looked directly at Clara. And I told them about a little girl who felt unloved because her parents were so busy loving a broken-down house. I told them about the guilt I have carried every single day of my life for that. "We did it for you, Clara. We thought we were building you a kingdom. We never realized you felt like a prisoner in it." Tears were streaming down Clara's face now. They were not the tears of a daughter mourning a lost connection, but the hot, frustrated tears of someone who had been caught. And I told them about my grandmother's locket, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. The one piece of my past I had left. I sold it to buy a water heater. I never even told your father. That locket is in the foundation of that inn, Clara. My history. My sacrifice. It's part of the mortar that holds the stones together. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle in the space between us. You talk about the inn as an asset. A property. Something to be sold off. You see dollar signs. But I see Arthur's sweat in the grain of the wood. I see my tears in the shine on the floors. I see our entire lives written on those walls. You didn't just forget who built it, Clara. You forgot what it was built with. It was built with love. And hope. and a whole lot of fear. And it was built with the pieces of ourselves we sacrificed along the way. I finally looked at Mark, whose face had gone pale. And you, Mark? You were supposed to be helping me, organizing my paperwork. Instead, you were organizing my surrender. And Mr. Davies, waiting by the door like a vulture? His offer is no longer on the table, because the property is no longer for sale. I pushed my chair back and stood up, my spine straight, my body feeling lighter than it had in years. The heavy stone in my chest was gone. Clara looked up at me, her face a mess of tears and confusion. Mom, what are you going to do? I'm going home, I said. I'm going back to my inn, and I'm going to start my next chapter, the one that I write. Leaving them there, amidst the ruins of a birthday party and a broken plan, was one of the hardest things I've ever done. It was like closing a door on a part of my own heart. I walked out of that restaurant without looking back, my head held high. The crisp afternoon air felt like a cleansing breath. I didn't take a taxi. I walked. The long walk back to the inn felt like a pilgrimage. With every step, I felt the years of doubt and sadness falling away. I was no longer a grieving widow. I was no longer a doting, oblivious mother. I was Eleanor Vance, the woman who stood in the freezing water and bailed. When I arrived, the inn was quiet, bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon. It looked beautiful, strong, enduring. It looked like home. I walked through the rooms, my hand trailing along the walls, but this time it wasn't a gesture of mourning. It was a gesture of reclamation. This was mine and Arthur's. The next day, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to my lawyer, a woman my own age who understood the meaning of legacy. I instructed her to draw up the necessary papers to turn the Willow Creek Inn into a trust. Upon my passing, it would not be sold. It would be managed by a board of directors from the Havenwood community, and its profits would fund an arts residency program for writers, painters, and carpenters, people who, like Arthur and me, knew how to build something beautiful out of nothing. It would be a place of creation, not commerce. Clara would receive a modest stipend, the inheritance a daughter could expect, but she would never be able to touch the inn. She would never be able to sell its soul. My second call was to a young couple I knew. They were guests who had been coming for years, a chef and a historian who always spoke of the inn with a reverence that reminded me of myself and Arthur. I offered them the position of resident managers, to live in and run the inn, to be its new custodians. Their joyful, tearful acceptance was the confirmation I needed. The inn's future was secure. Its story would continue. I haven't seen Clara or Mark since that day. She has called, of course. First with anger, then with apologies that sounded as hollow as her smile at the birthday lunch. I listen, but I do not engage. The wound is too deep, the trust too thoroughly shattered. Perhaps one day, forgiveness will find a way in, but for now, there is only a quiet, peaceful distance. Sometimes, in the evenings, I sit on the porch Arthur built. I watch the new managers bustling about, their faces full of the same tired, happy purpose we once had. I listen to the laughter of the artists in residence drifting from the library. I see the willows by the creek, their branches swaying in the breeze, their roots holding fast. I am 70 years old. I live in the house that love built. I am surrounded not by the ghosts of the past, but by the vibrant pulse of a future I created. My life is not over. My story is not finished. I simply turned the page and started writing a better, more honest chapter. And I did it all by myself. The first few months after my 70th birthday were like the quiet that follows a storm. The air at the Willow Creek Inn felt cleaner, the light brighter. The heavy, unspoken tension that had clouded my home for a year was gone, and in its place, a gentle, purposeful hum had returned. Ben and Sarah, the young couple I'd entrusted with the inn's daily life, were a godsend. He had a carpenter's touch, much like Arthur, and a quiet reverence for the old building. Sarah had a warmth that filled the dining room, her laughter echoing where my own had grown weary. They weren't just managers, they were stewards. They understood the soul of the place. The arts residency was a wild, beautiful success. A poet from Montreal filled my library with whispered verses. A painter from the Australian outback set up his easel in the meadow, trying to capture the shifting light on the water. Their creative energy was a transfusion for the inn and for me. I became the matriarch of this eclectic, ever-changing family. I'd share stories of Arthur. I'd offer critiques on a nearly finished canvas. I'd listen to a newly written chapter read aloud by the fireside. I had built a legacy, not of brick and mortar, but of inspiration. My life had a new rhythm, a peaceful cadence of tea in the morning, walks by the creek, and evenings filled with conversation and art. But in the quietest hours, when the last artist had gone to bed and the old house settled into its nightly symphony of groans and sighs, the silence from my daughter was a palpable presence. Clara had called a handful of times. The first call was a torrent of rage and accusation. She called the trust a betrayal, a public humiliation. She said I had chosen a house full of strangers over my own family. I listened. I did not argue. I simply said, "The inn is safe, Clara." That was my only goal. The calls that followed were different. They were stilted, awkward, circling the vast, silent crater between us. We spoke of the weather, of her work, of the grandchildren. Empty words, carefully chosen to avoid stepping on the shards of our broken relationship. She never apologized. I never asked her to. The wound was too deep for such simple salves. Mark was never mentioned. I assumed he was the silent partner in her anger, his disappointment fueling her resentment. I told myself I was at peace with the distance. It was the price of protecting Arthur's memory, the cost of preserving our life's work. It was a necessary amputation to save the whole. I had my new family of artists, I had Ben and Sarah, I had the inn. It was enough. I repeated this to myself like a mantra, hoping that one day it would feel entirely true. But a mother's heart has a phantom limb. You can sever the connection, but you still feel the ache where your child used to be. I saw her everywhere, in the face of a young guest, in the way a sunbeam hit the porch step where she used to sit, in the faint scar on the oak table where she'd carved her initials as a rebellious teenager. One rainy Tuesday in late autumn, I decided it was time to finally clear out the attic. It was a task I had been avoiding since Arthur's passing, a Pandora's box of memories I hadn't been strong enough to face. But now I felt a sense of resolve. It was time to let go of what needed to go and to properly cherish what needed to be kept. The attic smelled of cedar, dust, and time itself. Sunbeams, thick with dancing dust motes, sliced through the gloom from a single round window. There were boxes of Arthur's old tools, stacks of outdated financial ledgers, and my own long-forgotten sewing projects. Tucked away in a corner under a canvas sheet was a small wooden trunk. Clara's trunk. My breath caught in my throat. I ran a hand over the lid, the wood smooth beneath my palm. Arthur had made it for her when she was 10, a place for her to keep her treasures. I hadn't opened it in decades. With a creak of protest from the old brass hinges, I lifted the lid. Inside, it was a time capsule of a childhood. A collection of colorful sea glass. A bundle of letters from her summer camp pen pal. A slightly morbid diorama of a dinosaur scene, complete with a plastic T-Rex menacing a smaller, glue-stained herbivore. I smiled, a genuine, uncomplicated smile. This was my Clara, the little girl before the resentment had taken root. And then I saw it. Tucked beneath a faded blue ribbon she'd won at a school sports day was a folder of her schoolwork. On top was an essay from the 5th grade. The title, written in a child's careful, looping cursive, was My Home. A wave of nostalgia washed over me. I sat down on the dusty floorboards and began to read, expecting a charming, childish description of the inn. The first paragraph was just that. It described the big willow trees, the color of the front door, the smell of my baking. But then the tone shifted. My home is a very busy place, she had written. There are always new people here. They sleep in rooms that I am not allowed to play in. They eat at the big table, and my mother is always talking to them. She smiles at them a lot. Sometimes I pretend I am a guest, too. I say, "Good morning, Mrs. Vance," and she smiles at me just like she smiles at them. Then she asks if I have finished my homework. The words blurred as my eyes filled with tears. I read on, each sentence a small, sharp blow. My father is always fixing things. The house is always hungry, he says. It eats his time. I try to help him, but he says the tools are not for children. He tells the guests stories about the house. He never tells me stories anymore. My home has a lot of rooms, but none of them are just for me. My bedroom is where I sleep, but the rest of the house belongs to the guests. I wish we lived in a small house. A quiet house. A house that wasn't hungry. The essay ended with a simple, devastating sentence. My favorite time is when we have a power cut because all the guests get worried, but my mom lights candles and my dad tells me not to be scared, and for a little while, we are just a family again. I close the folder, the flimsy paper trembling in my hands. The neat, carefully constructed narrative of my life, the one where I was the self-sacrificing hero, crumbled into dust. I had seen my struggle, my work, my dream. I had never truly seen the lonely little girl living in the shadow of it. I remembered her pulling the petals off the daisy. I remembered her face when she left for college. It wasn't just teenage rebellion or a desire for a different life. It was an escape. An escape from being a stranger in her own home. All my righteous anger from that birthday lunch evaporated, replaced by a profound and harrowing guilt. I had won the battle for the inn, but in doing so, I had justified the very thing that had pushed my daughter away in the first place. I had chosen the house over her again. I had memorialized my sacrifice, but I had never properly acknowledged hers. She hadn't forgotten who built the inn. She had simply never been allowed to forget it. It was a constant, looming reminder of what she had lost, of the parental attention that had been redirected into plaster and floorboards. Her desperate, greedy attempt to sell it wasn't just about money. It was a primal, childish urge to destroy the monster that had eaten her family. I sat there in the dusty attic for what felt like hours, the rain drumming a mournful rhythm on the roof. The peace I had so carefully cultivated was a sham. It was a fortress built on a lie I had told myself. The fortress was safe, but I was all alone inside it. The new life at the inn, the artists, the legacy, it all felt hollow now. A beautiful, elaborate monument to my own failure as a mother. Just then, the shrill ring of the telephone downstairs cut through the silence. It was the old landline I kept in the kitchen, the one whose number only a few people had. Ben and Sarah knew to let it ring, that it was for me. Slowly, stiffly, I rose to my feet and made my way down the attic stairs, my heart pounding with a strange sense of premonition. I walked into the kitchen and picked up the receiver. "Hello," I said, my voice hoarse. There was a sniffle on the other end, then a small, trembling voice that shattered my world all over again. "Grandma?" It was Leo, my grandson. He sounded so small, so lost. "Leo, darling, what is it? Is everything all right?" "Grandma," he whispered, and I could hear he was trying not to cry. "Daddy's gone. He packed a bag this morning and he left. And Mommy won't stop crying. She's in her room, and she won't come out. I don't know what to do." I sank into the nearest kitchen chair, my knuckles white as I gripped the phone. The carefully constructed world of Mark and Clara, the successful career, the expensive suits, the perfect family, it was all a facade. And it had finally collapsed. My daughter, my estranged, angry, avaricious daughter, was alone and broken. And her little boy was calling me for help. In that moment, she was no longer the businesswoman who had tried to sell my life from under me. She was the little girl who wished for a power cut just to have her family back. The little girl who felt like a guest in her own home. The little girl who was now, once again, all alone in a house that was no longer a home. I looked around my beautiful kitchen at the gleaming copper pots, the sturdy butcher's block Arthur had made. I thought of the artists in the library, the legacy I had so proudly secured. And it all meant nothing. Nothing at all. "Leo," I said, my voice clear and steady, all hesitation gone. "You listen to me. You are a very good boy and a very brave boy. I want you to go and sit on the sofa and turn on the television. Can you do that for me?" "Okay, Grandma." "I'm coming," I said, more to myself than to him. "I'm on my way right now. Everything is going to be all right." I hung up the phone. I walked into the hall and found Sarah arranging a bouquet of late-blooming roses. She looked up and smiled, but the smile faded when she saw my face. "Eleanor, is everything okay?" I took a deep breath. The storm was over, but the flood was just beginning. And my daughter was drowning. I have to go, Sarah, I said, my voice devoid of all its earlier anger, all its pride. All that was left was the raw, aching core of a mother. I have to go for a few days. My daughter needs me. The drive to the city was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. Rain lashed against the windscreen, the wipers beating a frantic, rhythmic pulse that matched the pounding in my chest. Each town I passed, each familiar landmark on the highway, was a milestone on a road I had traveled 1,000 times, but never with such a heavy, urgent purpose. For years, this drive had been one of obligation, a trip to see a daughter who felt more like a stranger. Now it was a pilgrimage of penance. The image of Clara's childhood essay was seared into my mind, its looping curse of a testament to a loneliness I had authored and then ignored. I saw it all so clearly now. Her coolness towards the inn wasn't a rejection of my hard work. It was a defense mechanism against a place that had always felt like her rival. Her ambition, her desperate need for a life that looked successful and pristine from the outside, was a direct reaction to a childhood she perceived as dusty, chaotic, and secondary. She had built herself a life as different from the inn as possible, a clean, modern house in a manicured suburb, a career in a corporate office, a husband who dealt in numbers, not in splinters and sawdust. She had tried to build a fortress against the past, and now its walls had come crumbling down. And she was trapped in the rubble. When I pulled into her driveway, the scene was unnervingly still. The house, a large, modern colonial with pristine white siding and perfectly symmetrical windows, looked like a magazine cover. It had none of the rambling, lived-in character of the inn. It was a house that demanded perfection, a stage for a flawless life. But a child's bicycle lay on its side on the immaculate lawn, a single, jarring note of disarray. The front door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The silence was eerie. The air was cool and smelled faintly of air freshener and something else, despair. A man's jacket was slung over a chair, a coffee cup sat on the polished entryway table, a silent testament to a hasty departure. I walked through the stark white living room, where everything was arranged just so, the cushions on the sofa plumped, the coffee table books artfully stacked. It was a room to be looked at, not lived in. I found Leo first. He was curled up on the family room sofa, a brightly colored cartoon playing on the enormous television screen, its cheerful music a grotesque soundtrack to the misery in the house. He didn't seem to be watching it. He was just staring into the middle distance, his small face pale, his thumb in his mouth, a habit I hadn't seen in years. I knelt beside him and gently stroked his hair. He looked up, his eyes wide and full of a fear no child should have to carry. He didn't say a word. He just launched himself into my arms, his small body trembling with silent sobs. I held him tight, rocking him gently, murmuring the same soothing nonsense words I had murmured to his mother when she was his age and had woken from a nightmare. It's all right now. Grandma's here. Everything is going to be all right. After a few minutes, his sobs subsided into hiccups. I looked at him, wiping the tears from his cheeks with my thumb. "Where's Maya?" I asked softly. "In her room," he whispered. "She's playing with her dolls. She's pretending they're a happy family." The simple, brutal honesty of a child. My heart broke all over again. "And your mommy?" He pointed towards the hallway. "In her room. The door's locked." I left Leo with the television and a promise of cocoa and walked to the master bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was closed. I knocked gently. "Clara?" "Darling, it's Mom." Leo called me. There was no response. Only a profound, deadening silence. "Clara, please open the door. Let me in." I heard a faint rustling, then her voice, thick and raw. "Go away, Mom. I don't want you here. I don't want you to see this." It was the voice of shame. The voice of a woman whose carefully constructed world had imploded. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the door. My righteous anger was gone. My pride was gone. All that was left was a mother standing outside her child's locked door, just as I had been doing, metaphorically, for 30 years. "I found your essay, Clara," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "The one from the 5th grade. My home. I found it in your trunk in the attic." The silence on the other side of the door changed. It was no longer empty. It was listening. I read about the power cuts, I continued, my own voice breaking. I read about pretending to be a guest to get me to smile at you. Oh, my darling girl. I am so sorry. I was so busy building a life, I never saw that I was tearing yours apart. Please, Clara, open the door. It's my turn to be the guest. Let me in. I waited. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Then, I heard the click of the lock. The door opened a few inches. Clara stood there, a ghost of her former self. Her face was puffy and streaked with tears. Her expensive silk pajamas were rumpled. Her usually perfect hair was a tangled mess. She looked not at me, but at the floor, her shoulders hunched in defeat. She was my little girl again, lost and broken. I didn't hug her. Not yet. I just stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The room was a disaster. Clothes were strewn everywhere. Drawers were half open. A shattered picture frame lay on the floor. The smiling faces of her and Mark staring up from beneath a web of cracked glass. This was the epicenter of the explosion. I didn't say a word. I walked over and began to pick up the clothes, folding them into neat piles. I gathered the broken glass into a tissue and placed it in the wastebasket. I pulled the duvet up on the unmade bed. They were simple, maternal acts. Acts of service. Acts of love. I was not there to judge or to lecture. I was just there to help clean up the mess. Finally, she spoke, her voice a ragged whisper. He's gone. He said he couldn't live with the pressure anymore. The pressure to keep up this life. The mortgage, the cars, the club membership. It was all built on credit, Mom. A mountain of debt. He lost a huge amount of money on a bad investment. He was counting on the sale of the inn to fix it. When you created the trust, that was the end. It all made a sickening kind of sense. The desperation. The urgency of the birthday lunch. It wasn't just greed. It was panic. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her head in her hands. I pushed him. I pushed him so hard. I needed this life to work. I needed to prove that I could build something better than that place. Something clean and perfect. I just wanted to feel like I had a home that was my own. And now look, it's all gone. It was all a lie anyway. I sat down beside her, the mattress sinking under our combined weight. I didn't offer platitudes. I didn't say, I told you so. I just sat with her in the wreckage. The inn was hungry, I said softly, echoing the words from her essay. I know that now. Arthur and I, we fed it all of our time, all of our energy, all of our love. We thought we had enough left over for you, but we were wrong. It's the great regret of my life, Clara. I can't go back and fix it. I can't give you back your childhood. But I'm here now, and I am not going anywhere. She finally looked at me, her eyes searching mine, looking for the judgment, the condemnation she was so sure she would find. But all she found was my own profound grief. For her, for me, for all the years we had lost to a misunderstanding as old and as stubborn as the inn's stone foundation. She collapsed against me, her body racked with the kind of sobs that come from the deepest parts of the soul. And I held her. I held my daughter, my difficult, ambitious, broken daughter, and I rocked her like she was a child, my tears mingling with hers, washing away decades of hurt on the rumpled duvet of her ruined bed. I stayed for 2 weeks. It was a strange, fragile, and sacred time. We moved through the days in a sort of quiet truce with the past. I made cocoa for the children. I cooked simple, hearty meals in Clara's sterile, showpiece kitchen, filling the cold house with the warm smells of baking bread and roasting chicken. I read stories to Leo and Maya, who slowly began to emerge from their own shells of fear and confusion. They were resilient, as children are, and the simple, steady presence of a grandmother who wasn't crying was a powerful anchor in their appended world. Clara and I talked. We really talked, for the first time since she was a teenager. We didn't try to solve everything at once. We just shared stories. I told her about the night I sold the locket, a secret I had never even told Arthur. She cried, not for the locket, but for the weight of the secret I had carried alone. She told me about the crushing loneliness of her first year of college, the feeling of being an imposter among kids from wealthy, normal families. We unpacked our histories, piece by piece, not to place blame, but to simply understand. One afternoon, we went up to her attic, another space full of forgotten things. We found her old trunk, and together, we went through it. We laughed at the camp letters and the dinosaur diorama. When we got to the essay, she held it in her hands, her expression unreadable. "I was so angry for so long, Mom," she said quietly. "I felt like the inn was your real child, and I was just a boarder. When I met Mark, he understood that. He understood wanting something shiny and new, something that wasn't built on struggle. But we built a house, not a home. You and Dad, for all your struggle, you built a home." I just couldn't see it. The decision to sell her house was a practical one, but it felt like a monumental act of liberation. It was a way of dismantling the stage and admitting the play was over. The proceeds would clear the mountain of debt Mark had left behind and give her a small cushion to start again. The question, of course, was where to go. One evening, as we sat at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, the silence was heavy with it. "You could come home," I said, the words tentative, fragile. "To the inn. There's plenty of room. The old apartment above the barn, the one we lived in that first year. It's just used for storage now. Ben could help me fix it up." She looked at me, a flicker of the old apprehension in her eyes. "I don't know, Mom. The inn and me, we have a difficult history." "I know," I said, "but maybe it's time for a new chapter. Not as a guest. Not as a resentful daughter. Just as family. The house isn't hungry anymore, Clara. It's full. And it has room for you." 2 months later, they arrived. I watched from the porch as Clara's car, packed to the gills, pulled up the long gravel driveway. Leo and Maya tumbled out, their faces alight with excitement. No longer the pale, frightened children I had found in that silent house. They ran across the meadow towards the creek, their laughter carried on the crisp spring air. Clara got out of the car and just stood there for a moment, looking at the inn. She took it all in, the rambling porch, the climbing roses on the trellis, the steady plume of smoke from the chimney. I saw her shoulders, which had been hunched with worry for so long, finally relax. She looked at me and gave me a small, real smile. The apartment above the barn was simple, but it was cozy and bright. Ben had helped me restore the old wooden floors, and I had filled it with the softest quilts and furniture from the attic that held gentle memories. It was a space for them. Their own space, within the embrace of the larger home. Life settled into a new, beautiful rhythm. Clara, freed from the pressure of her corporate life, rediscovered parts of herself she'd long forgotten. She had a wonderful head for organizing, and she began helping me manage the residency program, her marketing skills used not to sell a product, but to champion an artist. I'd find her in the kitchen with Sarah, laughing as they tried out one of my old recipes. I saw her talking with the painter from Australia, her face animated as they discussed his work. She was connecting. She was participating. One warm summer evening, Clara and I were sitting on the porch, watching the fireflies begin to blink in the twilight. The children were catching them in a jar by the willows. The sound of a cello drifted from the open library window where our current musician-in-residence was practicing. "He's beautiful, isn't he?" Clara said, her voice soft. I knew she wasn't just talking about the music. She was talking about all of it. The life, the legacy, the home. "Yes," I said. "He is." She reached over and took my hand. Her touch was warm, her grip firm. It wasn't the appraising pat of a businessman or the hesitant touch of a stranger. It was the hand of my daughter. "Thank you, Mom," she whispered, "for not giving up on me, for bailing me out of the flood." I squeezed her hand, my heart so full it felt like it might burst. "The willows bend, Clara," I said, looking out at the magnificent old trees by the creek. "They bend, but their roots hold fast. We just had to remember we were rooted in the same soil all along." We sat there in comfortable silence, mother and daughter, watching the stars begin to appear in the vast, velvet sky. The inn was no longer a monument to my past, and it was no longer the source of her pain. It was simply home. A busy, beautiful, and sometimes difficult home, but one with enough rooms and enough love for all of us. My story wasn't over. It had just found its way back to the beginning and started again, better this time.